I'd like to talk with you today about the gift of sight. It was May 2015 when the Cook County Jail in Chicago, Illinois, made national and local headlines. It announced that a clinical psychologist was going to be running the institution. And for the first time in the history of our country, a clinical psychologist was going to be running a correctional institution. News outlets came from near and far to meet with me. They wanted to see who this person was that was going to take on this endeavor. At this point, I had been at the jail for more than 9 years. Despite having that time under my belt, the number one question I received was why I, as an African American woman and as a clinical psychologist, wanted to take on this endeavor and why I wanted to work in such an environment. Little did they know that that was not the first time that I was in a correctional institution. I grew up in a 2-parent household. I was the youngest of 3 siblings, and there were significant gaps in age between my siblings and I, so I oftentimes felt like an only child. My mother was a nurse, and my father made Afrocentric art and sold it in his store. We were a normal, low-income African-American family growing up in rural North Carolina. And in one day, my world crumbled. My sister and I were in our bedroom. We were doing our homework. It was a weekday afternoon. And all of a sudden, people started banging on every end of the house. I was terrified. I followed my sister to the front door, and I remember looking over her shoulder, and I saw more than a dozen sheriff officers standing armed with rifles. They were there for my father. They took my father away that day and changed my life forever. I was 8 years old. During the 2.5 years that my father was incarcerated, life was up and down for me. I was a very quiet child, believe it or not. And so I isolated quite a bit. I remember building these huge fortresses, or at least they were huge to me at the time, in my parents' dining room with their dining room chairs and bed sheets. And I would just play quietly for hours on end with my Barbie dolls in my fortress. If I'm honest with you, if I'm really honest, I will tell you that I carried a darkness with me, a sadness, fear, depression. The trauma of losing those nightly jazz listening sessions with my father, the trauma of losing these massive shoulders that used to hoist me up above the world and made me feel like I was on top of the world. The trauma of losing some of the most disgusting home-cooked meals I have ever tasted in my life. Seriously, I was an asthmatic as a child, and so when I would get a cold, I would get really sick. And it was easiest for my dad to stay home with me, and I hated it. I hated it because I knew he was gonna make me breakfast, he was gonna make me lunch, and it was gonna be disgusting. And so I would save these empty soda bottles in my bedroom, and I would shove the food in the soda bottles. And I would bury it in my wastebasket so he wouldn't find it. It was disgusting. But it was my dad. And the trauma of losing those precious moments ripped my heart out. Later in that academic year, I had a teacher's assistant, and she would be the first person outside of my family to really impact my life positively. She did something that was simply profound. She saw me. She saw that I wouldn't sit with the other kids in the lunchroom and talk. I would just eat by myself. She saw that I wouldn't play on the playground with the other kids. Instead, I would just sit idle at the jungle gym. And what would be really small gestures on her part but meant the world to me, she would sit beside me at lunch and just talk with me. She would invite me into the classroom during recess and after school and just say, help me. And I loved it because she would give me the most delicious butterscotch candy I had ever tasted. And that was a key moment for me. But what she really did was she gave me so much more. She was chipping away at that darkness that I held. Now, I was fortunate. I had a loving family. We used to visit my father in the prison every week. Every Saturday evening, my mom would make some elaborate meal, and we would pack it up on Sunday morning and take it to the prison and have Sunday dinner with my dad every Sunday, and I looked forward to those moments. Within a couple of years, my dad returned home. More people would impact my life positively. I was thriving in school. Life was good. It was that experience and a few others that really inspired me to go into criminal justice, a field that is so wrought with darkness that it is difficult to see even the person standing right in front of you. I started my career at Cook County Jail in September 2006. And I remember that day I walked into that massive 96-acre compound, 96 acres. I was floored, I was frantic, I was frightened, all of the F words that you could possibly think of. That one too. And to give some context, there were about 10,000 inmates housed at this facility at this time. 10,000. And every day, we were processing in 300 more. It was a city within a city. It was daunting, one where you could easily get lost. Fast forward several years, and in April 2015, the sheriff called me into his office. It was never good if the sheriff called you into his office. And I remember he sat me down and he said, Nneka, I want you to run the jail for me. Excuse me? He said, I want you to run the jail for me. And in a moment where I should have been celebrating and hyped up, I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders, and I was overcome with fear because I knew that that responsibility meant that I had to see those thousands of people that were in that institution. And when I thought about what life was like for the men and women that were locked in those cages, I saw hopelessness in their eyes. I saw despair. I saw darkness. But this darkness was not like the darkness that my 8-year-old self experienced. It was much worse. It was unrelenting. It was crushing. It was the kind of darkness that you can't easily see your way out of. And I knew I was going to be responsible for those individuals. I saw so many people battling that darkness, and many of them lost. I remember the first day I met Timothy. He was 17 years old and had just come into the jail. He was charged with first-degree murder of his best friend. Because of his age and because of the nature of his charge, I wanted to see him. I wanted to speak with him. And when I walked onto that living unit and I asked the officer to pull Timothy out of his cell, I remember seeing this hardened, menacing look on Timothy's face. And I heard his cellmate say, "Hey, killer." Killer. He was 17. When Timothy walked into the room with me and the door closed, I looked at him and I said, "You are not a killer." And within a matter of seconds, that hard, menacing look faded into a flurry of tears. I didn't say anything else in that moment. I couldn't. I just sat with Timothy and let him cry. You see, Timothy wanted to be somebody. Timothy wanted to go places. But like so many of our youth growing up in poverty and surrounded by pain, he had been failed by countless systems. Failed by his family, failed by his school, failed by his church, failed by the community. They didn't see Timothy. And they didn't see all of the pain that this young man was carrying with him. It wasn't long until Timothy joined a gang. And one day, rivals appeared. A fight ensued, and Timothy's friend was killed from a gunshot wound. Now, I don't know the specifics of what happened that day, but I know that in that room, in that moment with Timothy, I did not see a killer. I saw a child wanting to be loved, a child who was burdened with darkness, a child that we failed. There were thousands of Timothys in that jail. And I knew that we had to do something for them, but I couldn't do everything. So it was my responsibility to challenge my staff to see everyone that we were responsible for, to see them beyond their uniform, to see them beyond their circumstances, to see them beyond the charges that they were in the jail for, to see them beyond their behavior. It was through that gift of sight that we were really able to chip away at the darkness that was within that jail. Within a couple of years, we really began to see progress. Inmates that hadn't been in a classroom in years were taking college courses in the jail. Inmates that had not had an earnable living in the community were now learning skills so that they could earn a living for their families in hospitality and construction and food service. Inmates were talking through their traumas in talk therapy. They were healing through yoga and meditation. Inmates were smiling. We did that just through the power of sight. Now, on the surface, we were very proud of the work that we did, and you can read about it in several news highlights. But what lies in the dirty details is that we were still failing people because people were coming into the jail broken. Our community was failing people, and I was a part of that community. It is so easy for us to turn a blind eye and to look at people as the other. It is so easy for us to say, that's not my problem. But you know what? Those are our children. Those are our babies. And I could no longer turn a blind eye. I left Cook County Jail in March of this year in search of finding a way to impact youth before they were broken, to impact youth so that they wouldn't end up in the criminal justice system. I thought about what my life would have been like if people let me sit in my darkness. And I thought about Timothy and the untapped potential that was within him. I found my answer in conversations with a colleague, a kindred spirit. Liz Dozier was the principal at Fenger High School, a high school on the south side of Chicago. And Liz saw the untapped potential in our youth. She nurtured the beauty of our children, but also saw what that darkness could do if left unchecked. And Liz wanted to do more for our children. That more was Chicago Beyond. Liz created Chicago Beyond in 2016 as a way to mobilize resources and people and money to help our children. In 2 short years, Liz and Chicago Beyond invested more than $30 million in 12 nonprofit organizations focused on helping our children. And now they were investing in me. Chicago Beyond is giving me the latitude to target this unyielding problem of mental wellness in our communities, to target this issue of children contending with parental incarceration. Chicago Beyond is giving me the latitude to see our children and to do something for them and with them. To see their beauty, to see their untapped potential, and to celebrate their successes and their accomplishments with them, so we don't continue to have Timothys. The catalyst for change is rooted in what we allow ourselves to see. And it is our responsibility, all of our responsibility, to give the gift of sight. Thank you.